wanted to say thank you very much, everybody, for coming. We've got a great turnout today. My name is Michelle Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, and I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking about logistics for the day, doing some introductions, and first of all, most importantly, doing some thank yous. So we have great turnout from elected officials today, and I wanted to thank our elected officials for being here. From the state government, we have Assembly Member Sandy Galiff, who is here. Thank you for coming. And I do have a bunch of thank yous, so if you would want to hold applause to the end of the thank yous, that would be great, so I can keep in my time. And from the town of Phillipstown, we have board member Mike Leonard. From the town of Cornwall, I'm not sure if he's here yet, but Michael Summerfield was coming. From the town of Putnam Valley, Wendy Wetzel. From the town of Woodbury, Jackie Hernandez. From the village of Cold Spring, Steve Vellotto. And from the city of Beacon, Lee Kariaku. Are there any elected officials that I did not mention yet? Hopefully not. Great. And then I wanted to thank our very dedicated, hardworking and extremely talented staff at the Hudson Highlands Land Trust. And first of all, I wanted to thank Ashley Roush, who's at the back. And she is our new Outreach and Events Manager. And she's only been with us just less than 3 months. And she put this event on. And we've got record turnout. And actually, I think that is actually worth a round of applause. So she did a great job. And we also have here, who you probably met when you came in, our operations coordinator, Jonathan Leitner. We have a new manager of public policy and planning, Karen Doyle, who's up the back there. And she's actually going to be leading a breakout this afternoon on Phillipstown water. From our land conservation staff, we have Katrina Schindeldecker is here, and Nicole Wooten, who's up on slides just in the corner here. And I want to thank our wonderful sponsors, the Highlands Country Club, for hosting this, to Randy Schlesinger, who donated her time to do the brochures and the posters for this event that look fantastic. To our number one volunteer for the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, who's up the back trying to hide, Linda Lang, and she comes in and volunteers with us every week and comes to our events as well. We have a new volunteer, Elizabeth Bradford, who's also helping at the registration desk. We have 4 Haldane high school students who are here sitting in the corner, who you'll meet as you hand them your question cards. And I think we have quite a few board members, between 5 and 10 board members here from the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, and I'd like to thank them all for coming today. We also have here, and I wanted to give a shout out, I won't name them individually because there are quite a few here, but we have members of planning boards, conservation advisory councils, zoning boards here from across the Hudson Highlands, from different cities, towns and villages, and I want to thank them not only for coming today but for all the work that they do in terms of land use in our local municipalities, because that work is really important for water. And what's interesting about that, of course, New York State is a home rule state, so at the smallest municipal level, that's where land use decisions get made. And that's why we have all these, boards, these planning boards and conservation boards giving input on land use that impacts water. And one of the most challenging things, though, that's great from the perspective of, expressing the community's wishes in land use, but one of the most challenging things with that structure is that often when it comes to water, the place where water comes from and the place where it's consumed are 2 different municipalities. And that is at the heart of a lot of the water problems we have. We'll hear more about it in talking about things like the Newburgh water crisis today. And really, when you have situations like that, you have these intermunicipal cooperation issues, in a way, you have to kind of appeal to the higher power. And in this case, the higher power is the state government and the federal government. And I'm guessing that right now, probably the state government is the best place to go to fix some of these issues, and they have been doing a lot, which is why I'm going to ask, when I finish speaking, I'm going to ask Assemblymember Galef just to say a couple of words about what the state's role in water, because the state has really taken this on as a very important issue to help these small municipalities with their water systems. After Sandy speaks, then I'm going to hand it over to another force of nature, which is Carla Castillo, who is our moderator for the panel this morning. And she's going to introduce the speakers, and she's going to start with a Q&A to the panelists, and that'll go until about noon. And then after that, we'll have questions from the audience, from you. And what you'll see on your chairs, if you've been here before, you know how this goes. What you'll see on your chairs, you have cards on your chairs and pencils on your chairs. If you can write down your questions very legibly and in big writing so that I can read it, then we'll have the volunteers take the cards and bring them down. And that will go, so that the audience Q&A will go from about noon to 12:30. At 12:30 we'll stop and we'll have lunch, and then we'll have lunch from 12:30 to 1:30, and then we'll start with the breakouts after that, and I'll explain the logistics for that just after lunch. So with that, I'll just mention Carla is the chair of the Cornwall Conservation Advisory Council and works for the Hudson Valley Regional Council. And then, as I mentioned just before she speaks, I'd like to ask Assemblymember Galef to come up and say a few words. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's always good to be here. I always come away learning so much, and I'm sure that everybody in the audience feels the same way. That and then kind of connecting with different communities is so very important. And in the learning phase, I think I've learned that we are all 60% water. Are we? Our bodies? Are we more than that? More than that. Okay. With more than that, we really have to think about, just on a very personal basis, what's happening with our water. Clean water is one of our greatest resources, and I think the state of New York, we have the advantage of having wonderful water resources that many other states do not have. But we need to be sure that our water is kept clean, it keeps us alive. But there have been examples of consequences when the cleanliness of our water sources are compromised. And too frequently around the country and around the world, we've heard about that. And last year, we did pass legislation in Albany to enable schools and municipalities to test for lead in the drinking water in the schools, in the water fountains. And so when you find it in a number of schools that the water fountains were actually just turned off, because we wanted to ensure that our young children are drinking water that are not doing harm to them. But it doesn't, good water does not start in the pipes, as we all know, which I think you just mentioned. It's all around. This year, we held funding for the Environmental Protection Fund steady for the third year in a row at its highest level since it was first implemented, and continued funding the Clean Water Infrastructure Act with $2.5 billion for drinking water infrastructure and source water protection. And I have to tell you, a lot of people sitting in this audience were up in my office and in everybody else's office to be able to protect those funds, and I applaud them for all of their good work. Sometimes legislators are in their office, but not in their office when you come up, but we hear that you are there, and that makes a big difference. Healthy water depends on a healthy watershed, and there are many steps we can take to ensure that water bodies remain beautiful, healthy, and clean. The state has implemented this year, and I know the governor had a number of presentations, which you may have gone to. I was not there, but for a $65 million initiative to combat algal blooms in upstate New York, using funds from the Clean Water Infrastructure Act and the Environmental Protection Fund. And algal blooms can be incredibly harmful to our water bodies and the wildlife that rely on them. Causing illness and uninhabitable surroundings, so that is really important. I don't know exactly what upstate is, I guess. It depends on who you are, whether the impacts are down here or not. But there are going to be grant opportunities for so many of these programs. In fact, I think there's one in Westchester coming up this week or next with the access to grant opportunities for watershed protection and clean water. So you just have to kind of keep up with those opportunities and the deadlines for doing that. So it's so great to be here with these wonderful experts. I look forward to learning so much more. I am not the expert, they are, but as legislators, the more we learn, the better we are in our jobs as we're working to vote on different kinds of legislation and promoting certain things in our New York State budget. So it was a good year in our budget for the environment. Not always a good year for some other things, but it was a good year for the environment, and take advantage of it. So it's great. Thank you very much. Thank you for letting me come.
Hi, good morning. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that wonderful welcome, Michelle. And I am hoping that today you will learn a lot from our wonderful panel of experts and take some messaging back in terms of what you can do on your own in your home municipality. So my name is Carla Castillo, and today I'm wearing two hats, as Michelle mentioned. I'm the Senior and Regional Planner, Regional Clean Energy Communities Director at the Hudson Valley Regional Council, and Chair of the Cornwall Conservation Council in my home municipality. So it's a real honor to be here today with you because you are all partners who are interested in protecting our drinking water through prevention rather than expensive cures. The Hudson Valley, a place of great beauty that we call home, where many of us work, and that has been shaped by the above and below ground infrastructure that makes our lives comfortable. Unfortunately, many past land use decisions have had a detrimental impact on our water quality. Today, our panelists are going to help us understand the impact of these decisions on some nearby municipalities and share the multifaceted work being done to address existing issues and to implement smarter practices. I'm going to take a few minutes to set the stage before hearing from our panel. Today we have Paul Gallet, President of Riverkeeper, Peter Smith of the Quassia Creek Watershed Alliance, Russell Urban Mead of Chazen Companies, and Alyssa Che of Cornell Water Resource Institute and the DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program. Following my presentation, as Michelle mentioned, we'll have some predetermined questions, and then the last 30 minutes we will focus on questions from you. So please think about as many questions as you can. Next, please. So drinking water issues worldwide can be neatly categorized under quality and availability, those two umbrellas. The ways in which they appear at the local and regional levels depends on a variety of factors, including poor land use practices, watershed mismanagement, and the compounding effects of climate change, just to name a few. In Newburgh, 29,000 residents learned that their drinking water from Washington Lake was unsafe due to a spill of firefighting foam in the early 1990s. Back then, we were not aware of the health effects of perfluorooctane sulfonate found in the foam. For Woodbury and Cornwall, the daily draw of 612,000 gallons of water has raised concern about long-term water availability for residents both on private wells and municipal water customers. Residents also fear permanent damage to the Woodbury Creek habitat. The specter of large-scale development led Beacon in 2017 to institute a 6-month building moratorium due to concerns that population was outpacing water projections. 15 years ago, however, northern Westchester municipalities were attempting to exert control over development proposals in Putnam that could impact Peekskill Hollowbrook watershed. Prevention versus cure. For Newburgh, the price to cure is in the range of $15 million and long-term, as will be regaining the trust of residents. Prevention through the application of green infrastructure techniques, preservation of open space for the natural filtration of surface water, and promotion of efficient and sustainable land development are just some of the significantly less costly measures that are available today. So here you have a long list of actors that I know those of you in the back cannot read, but these are all folks who are trying to address our drinking water issues. Now, this list is far from comprehensive, but it highlights some of the key participants and residents, and for residents, ways in which you can take action. I'm going to highlight just some of them, and some of these have already been spoken about a little bit previously. So at the federal level, the Safe Drinking Water and Clean Water Acts require the EPA to develop regulatory standards, programs, and tools to protect source water. Then at the state level, you have the Departments of Health and Environmental Conservation that have significant legal authority to enforce federal pollution prevention standards and implement EPA programs. Since 2012, Governor Cuomo and the state legislature have passed many legislative acts that deepen the state's water quality efforts, protection efforts. The DEC's Hudson River Estuary Program is another state program that protects and revitalizes the Hudson River Valley for our enjoyment and develops very accessible educational materials. You'll find a number of them at the back of the room today of the type of work that the Hudson River Estuary Program has funded to help you understand the watershed issues. And these are for not just residents, but municipalities and municipal leaders who are trying to make changes and improvements in their communities. Low-cost financing for much-needed water quality infrastructure projects is available to municipalities through the Environmental Facilities Corporation. And then moving down to the county level, the county health departments partner with the State Department of Health to regulate the operation, design, and quality of public water supplies and commercial bottled water suppliers. Then there are water authorities like the Orange County Water Authority that focuses on water supply, water resource protection, watershed planning, conservation, and education. You also have county soil and water conservation districts that link the protection and conservation of farmland and wildlife with soil and water, which makes a lot of sense. As Michelle mentioned, at the local level, the role of elected officials, planning board members, and comprehensive planning committee members is very, very important. They work to develop formal source water protective positions and regulations, and then they need to make sure that municipal staff enforces those in their municipality. The regional and local organizations that are in the third column are just some of those that are working in the Hudson Valley, and they include land trusts, such as the Hudson Highlands Land Trust, which offers really wonderful educational programming like today's, and conserved land that protects our water resources. Riverkeeper, which recently developed a municipal self-assessment tool designed to reveal how well water supplies are being protected in your communities. The Hudson River Watershed Alliance, which works to protect, educate, and conserve and restore the water resources in the Hudson River Basin. So, there are a lot of actors. And where does that leave you, many of you who are residents? Despite the plethora of governmental and non-governmental entities, you still have a real critical role to play. As Peter Smith will share, the watchful eyes of residents in partnership with resident-led organizations like watershed groups can bring important issues to the forefront of key decision makers and funders. You can also become an appointed member of your community's Conservation Advisory Council and learn what areas in your community should be protected by developing a natural resources inventory. You can encourage your community to pursue NYSERDA's Clean Energy Communities program and Climate Smart Community and become a climate smart community by preserving natural resources through zoning and other regulations and many other ways in which to do it. You can encourage your schools and children to participate in citizen science projects that gauge the health of our streams and water bodies And you can take personal action by properly disposing of medicines, engine oil, and other pollutants that unfortunately find their way into our waterways and drinking water too often. And you can tell a friend, because sharing this knowledge is super important. So now we'll move on to the predetermined questions. We have these set of questions, and then please take your time to jot down some questions that we will ask later on. Okay, so we're going to focus first on what we learned from the Newburgh crisis. And I'm going to ask you to try to keep your responses to roughly about 3 minutes. Does that make sense? And so I will be here as your timekeeper as well. And we're going to start with Peter Smith. So, Peter, can you tell us how the Newburgh contamination crisis came about and what could have been done to prevent it?
I can, but you know what I'd rather do? I have a very ugly story to tell you, and the crisis and the issue, can you hear me? Didn't begin with the EPA suddenly lowering the acceptable rate of PFOS in your water from 200 to 80. Our watershed group formed about 9 years ago, and we agreed to help Orange County's Planning Department and the Orange County Water Authority put together a management plan for the Quassia Creek Basin. And I have a fairly long list. It may take 4 minutes, Carla, but it may take 7 minutes. But we discovered a lot of things as we began doing this work. For example, as we began exploring the watershed, we discovered that the city of Newburgh's drinking watershed is indeed a sub-watershed of the Quassia Creek. It had been mischaracterized in multiple and contradictory ways, and still is. The state still has it. And in fact, those of you who were interested in the Pilgrim Pipeline a couple of years ago, in their draft environmental impact statement, the city of Newburgh's drinking water is not even an issue for them. The pipeline, which would be traveling through it, not a problem. And they have it draining into the Moodna Creek. We learned that contributing streams, Silver Stream, Patton Brook, and the subtributaries are misclassified as D. They should be A. Source drinking water should be classified as A. That has not been corrected. 9 years later. A 60-acre contiguous wetland through which the New York State Thruway runs is mischaracterized as numerous small wetlands that fall below the area of oversight by the DEC. This wetland contributes to water to the main reservoir. It even includes a capped Town of New Windsor landfill, which is not considered to be the best remedy for landfills. You don't cap them in a wetland because they become the tea bag that keeps on giving. So this, wetland is not considered source drinking water, even though it drains right into Patton Brook, which is diverted into the reservoir. There's a capped landfill on the Air National Guard base that is within the Newburgh drainage. Now this was interesting. We learned something yesterday when we had a tour of the new filtration plant, that one of the concerns within the last 15 or 20 years was that Washington Lake, the city's main reservoir, lies in the flight path of the old C-5As and the C-17s to Stewart Airport, and that should there be a fuel dump, which often happens, it would happen into the reservoir. Should there be a crash, it would happen there. And there were no remedies really happening to try to prevent something like that. I guess you could reroute things, you could change things, but indeed nothing happened. Here's another thrilling thing that we discovered, if you needed any more. Briefly, Washington Lake has two supplemental sources of water, Silver Stream and Patton Brook, and they were tapped for drought periods, and this has evolved over the period of 100 years. Now, the job of these lands and maintaining the source water plans lies within the Department of Health. And we discovered that the Patton Brook subwatershed vanished from the maps of the Department of Health. Poof! And it seems to have happened at the time the interconnection between I-87 and I-84 was happening. And at the same time, a lot of very valuable commercial real estate in that subwatershed was becoming possible.
Peter, we're
We're
approaching.
over?
Yeah, we're approaching the 5-minute mark.
Is that all I took?
Yes,
Can I
isn't
keep
that
going with
amazing?
some of these later? It gets better, by
Yes,
the way.
yes, you
All right,
definitely
good.
can.
Stay
Thanks.
tuned, everybody.
There is a breakout where we'll have plenty of opportunity for conversation.
Good.
And Carla, so in terms of responding to some of the comments, I do have some responses, but I'll leave it up to you to call on me when you're ready for those.
Great, thank you. So Paul, in terms of Riverkeeper, how has Riverkeeper responded to the Newburgh water crisis, and what steps is Riverkeeper taking now with other municipalities?
Well, thanks, Carla. I'm really happy to be here and appreciate the time that you're all taking to assure that you get schooled up on this. I know it can seem like a thicket of information, so I'm going to try to start off at the shallow end, because I think it's really important to remember some very basic principles and then add the complexity later. Riverkeeper, as you most know, has been around since the Storm King battle 50 plus years ago. And we are protecting the Hudson River and the drinking water supplies. And we were part of the agreement in about 20 years ago on the New York City drinking water supply. And that agreement was famous worldwide because it took an approach where it wasn't just filtration of drinking water supplies. It was trying to keep pollution out of those drinking water supplies in the first place to put less pressure on the filtration plant and the treatment of the water. It's always better if you can keep the contamination out of the system. And much of what Peter talked about is what happens when you haven't kept the pollution out of the system. So if I could give you 3 simple priorities that everything that I say today is going to track back to. One is invest in infrastructure, and as Sandy Galef put it, there's over $2.5 billion for that didn't exist 3 years ago, which is really great. We're bucking the trend of not investing in our infrastructure, and New York is leading on that. We want to track down the most significant sources of pollution and reduce them, and much more about that later. And we have to get ahead of emerging contaminants that we're just starting to understand have been introduced into the system, like PFOS, and figure out how to assure that they are not causing harm in ways that we don't even understand. But the thing that links together everything we do here is an understanding that surface water resources and groundwater resources are linked. If you draw down your groundwater resources, you're going to have less water in your streams and creeks and rivers, and that's going to affect wildlife. Everything is connected to everything else, Barry Commoner famously said. And the thing that you need to know, and I think I'll take less time than 3 minutes, is that you all, I know you will, it's yours to take. What you do affects what government does. Riverkeeper has a very simple mantra. It's a 3-part mantra. We try to be true to the grassroots, we try to be relentlessly data-driven, and we don't flinch when the going gets tough. And the most important of those is to be community-driven, because you guys are the ones that make change. We have 30 people in Ossining. We put money into the Ossining economy. Some of my staff members vote in Ossining. But outside of Ossining, if we don't work with communities, we really don't have power, no matter how good our data is, no matter how tough we're willing to be. So I think I'll leave it at that for now, but that's really the summary of it. Get money into the system invest in infrastructure here in the Hudson Valley, track down the most significant sources of remaining pollution and reduce them, and we have a very detailed program I'll share with you a little later to do that and get ahead of emerging contaminants.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Elisa, I know you want to follow up on some of the comments that, that Peter shared. I would also love if you could touch on the implications of being proactive versus reactive and what some of those approaches are to water quality that the state is looking at right now.
Okay, thanks, Carla.
Thank you.
So there is so much that I could say on source water. I know Carla gave a brief intro of me, but I'll just reiterate. I'm the source water protection specialist for the New York State DEC Hudson River Estuary Program. We also have a partnership with the Water Resources Institute at Cornell University. And first, I guess I'll start off just by addressing a couple of the points that Peter made. And I have bullet points here. The classification of streams is important. DEC uses the classification of streams as one of the ways to protect the water quality. So when Peter mentioned that the streams, the feeder tributaries to some of the reservoirs were classified as D, that was an error in the online map that translated from the online mapper side. So on DEC side, the permit reviewers do have them as A's and treat them as such when they're deciding to grant permits or not for activities along those tribs. That error has since been corrected, so if you were to go on the online mapper, DEC Environmental Mapper, all the classifications are accurate now. There was a correction made, so that's good news there, hopefully. The other point was about the bisected wetlands on either side of the thruway that DEC, Peter said, doesn't recognize. And I have a question. So as background, DEC has a certain threshold size for wetland protection and designation. There, as with lots of regulations, there are exceptions. So if a municipality submits to DEC certain wetland for consideration, DEC would take that into consideration. So I don't know if you know if the city has ever submitted an application to DEC to have those two wetlands recognized under a different protection designation. And if not, maybe that's an idea for the city to look into, and the watershed group, I'm sure, has a lot of information already that they could help with on that. And I know my time is running through.
No. Actually, I was wondering if you could, many of folks in the audience may not know the formal definition of what source water is. So before you continue, if you could define that, please.
Sure.
Thank you.
So source water is just a fancy term for a source of drinking water. I guess the most significant aspect of that term is that it differentiates it from finished water, which is what the Department of Health calls the treated drinking water that comes out of the tap. So that's the water after it's been through the treatment plant is called finished water, and that water is subject to many, many detailed regulations that the Department of Health is authorized to implement. So these are your numerical limits, so-and-so amounts. It has to be under this many micrograms of whatever the contaminant or pollutant is. There's a lot of regulations on that, on what finished water and the standards that it has to meet so that it's considered safe to drink. Those regulations ultimately come from EPA and come down through New York State Department of Health. Source water is the raw water, so the water in the reservoirs and the lakes or the aquifers before it reaches the treatment plant. And so there is an overlap and cooperation between DEC and DOH on that side of things. In some states, the Department of Health and the Department of Environmental Conservation or Resources is merged into one when it comes to drinking water oversight. In New York State, it's separate, so that has some implications as well. Just very quickly, I know you wanted me to talk about proactive versus reactive approaches. So in my work, when it comes to source water protection, you're looking at the ambient water quality. You're not necessarily worried about the treatment plant side of things, where you do chlorination and those sorts of processes to clean the water that comes in. It is starting from even before that point of keeping the incoming water as clean as possible. And that's my role at DEC, is to help the sources of drinking water, so the water in the rivers and lakes and in the aquifers, as clean as possible before it gets to the treatment plant. Many times, well, I think up until now, maybe for Newburgh and Hoosick Falls and Flint, we've taken our drinking water for granted. We haven't had to think about, where it comes from. Most people probably still don't really know where their source of drinking water is, and that's because there hasn't been very many issues. We're getting to a point in time now where that's changed, where people are worried about their drinking water. We have CECs, or contaminants of emerging concern, where the detection technology has gotten so good that you can detect substances in your water before the human health impact research has caught up. So we're finding substances in drinking water that are alarming to residents before the human health impact studies have come out to say, okay, X level is considered no human impact. Above that, there is. So we have a mismatch here in things trying to catch up. On the proactive side, if you have good land use management practices in place, so this means at the local level, your planning boards are aware of where your source waters are. Your local decision makers understand what uses are happening in your watershed areas or the drainage areas for your drinking water sources, and making the best decisions they can to keep contaminants out of that water in the first place. That's kind of the thinking that we need to shift to these days, and that proactive approach ultimately ends up saving not only money, because the treatment costs can be very significant, especially when you're talking about new carbon filters to filter out the emerging contaminants, but there are also cost savings in terms of human health. The cleaner the water is that you start with, the less chemicals you have to add to make it clean and safe to drink. Some of you may be familiar with the term disinfection byproducts, or DBPs. Kind of maybe ironically, we put chemicals in drinking water in the treatment plants to help make it safe to drink. But it's a known side effect that the more chemicals you add, and if the conditions are right, certain chemical reactions happen where you get DBPs, or disinfection byproducts, which do have a negative human health impact. So the water operators at the plant are always counterbalancing those, making sure they're putting in just enough chemicals so that they avoid disinfection byproduct buildup. But it's a known thing, it's in the regulations, and so the cleaner your water is, the less chemicals you add, the less DBP buildup risk you have. So I have a few other things, but I will leave it at that.
Thank
One
you.
last
That's
thing very
perfect.
quickly
Sure.
is I would say, given what the state's activities are these days and the increased attention on source water protection, now is the time for local communities, and even at the regional county level, to voice their source water concerns and their gaps and the local needs on source water to your local leaders as well as the state. There are many things happening now. Funding is in place. A new source water protection program is being created now, and input is welcome from the local level. So now is the time to understand your source water and invest in studies if you don't. The estuary program that I work for has funding available to help communities better understand your source watersheds. So now's the time to get that information together and voice those concerns up to the state.
Thank you, Alyssa. That's really great advice. Now is the time to let our concerns be known. Okay, so the next topic that we're going to cover with questions is the groundwater issues. And this question goes to Russell Urban-Mead. And Russell, we were wondering if you could share the primary findings from the last Phillipstown water study, and what are some of the key contemporary issues impacting groundwater around the state?
Sure. Good morning. I am a hydrogeologist, and I've had the pleasure to work on the proactive and the reactive side over my years. The reactive side is, if there's a spill, how do you remediate it? And we can all think of those kinds of stories. The proactive side is the side that I enjoy. I've worked for many, many years as a consultant to Dutchess County Planning Department. And in Dutchess County, we have a gauging program for streams and groundwaters. We have a model aquifer protection ordinance available for municipalities to consider. We've evaluated aquifer recharge rates and backed out of that what a sustainable density should be for septic systems, so that wells and domestic septic systems can be balanced. So those are some of the kind of proactive programs that communities can consider. We helped Orange County also establish a gauging program on streams. And you would ask me perhaps why does a hydrogeologist care about flows in streams? The answer is, as somebody pointed out earlier, things are all connected. Let me use some really round numbers for you. We get perhaps 40 inches of rain a year. Of that, about 20 inches support our plants and evaporate. So evapotranspiration processes remove about 20 inches, which leaves us 20 inches for streams and aquifers. Depending on the porosity of soil, that other 20 inches either all sinks into the ground and supports aquifers, or some share of it does. And then if you have areas that are either bare impervious rock or clay, it's all runoff. So that second half of the annual precipitation, loosely speaking, is either runoff or underground runoff, which is what I would call groundwater migration and groundwater movement. And my life has been really focused on the groundwater piece. I'm the Lorax for aquifers, if you will. And I care about what's in the streams, because the stream is what tells us during a dry period how much water is coming out of the aquifer. If you've ever wondered why, 4 or 5 or 6 weeks into a drought, the stream is still flowing, it's because the rain that fell 6 months or a year earlier, that portion of it which sunk into the ground is only getting to the stream now. It's the opposite of overland flow is underland flow. That's an unconventional way of thinking about groundwater flow. And to the degree that we can intercept that underground flow or underflow with wells, we have the ability to supply ourselves with water. And it's a fabulous free storage device, if you will. We didn't have to pay for a water tower. We didn't have to build a reservoir. We just had to drill a well in the right spot and intercept that water, which fell on the land and is traveling below grade toward the stream system. So I will not miss the opportunity to say the one thing that I do say at these kind of events is that there are an awful lot of places in the world that don't get anywhere near the precipitation we do. 10 inches, 5 inches, 20 inches, and we get somewhere between 35 and 40 plus, depending on where you are in the Hudson Valley here. We also have the advantage of the entire Mohawk and Adirondack collection system bringing water past us in the Hudson River. So if you're at least sort of north of Newburgh, that's a source of fresh water in addition to groundwater and precipitation. And lastly, our climate models are all suggesting that we're going to get this or more in the future, which is in contrast to other parts of the world where the models are that there will be less. So I think that those three factors, ample precipitation, the fresh water brought to us by the Hudson, and the climate models, do put us in kind of a sweet spot relative to water. And if we can't figure it out here, shame on us. Really shame on us. In terms of groundwater planning, the proactive steps are, and I'll lean to in the direction that Elise just laid out, if you understand where your source water is coming from, then you work backwards and say what's happening on the landscape through which the recharge happens to supply that well over its duration of use. People ask me all the time, what is an aquifer and where are our aquifers? My simple answer to you is any place that there is a well is, for the perspective of that user, an aquifer. It's true that the steep upland areas where your well only produces 3 or 5 gallons a minute isn't a very productive aquifer, but it's the aquifer you have. It's funny, there's a blend, there's a place where science and practicality comes together in the definition of aquifer. The technical definition of an aquifer is a geologic formation that produces an economically viable volume of water. Well, for the person up on the hilltop, 3 gallons a minute defines whether that house has value or no value. And so I would submit to you that the groundwater in that location is absolutely, it's a low yield aquifer, but it is an aquifer. And then often down in our valley bottoms, we have sand and gravel, thanks to the departing glaciers, that can support a well that might produce 100 or 200 or 500 gallons a minute. So that's sort of your geology, hydrogeology 101. Water resource planning has to do with the land use management and understandings of how much water can take. DEC has some regulations for the impact you can have on streams. If you place wells right near a stream, Paul is absolutely right. You can pump that aquifer hard enough that the stream flow is influenced. Up to a certain point, that may be acceptable. Beyond a certain point, it probably isn't acceptable for a range of reasons, and that's part of the reason that Orange County and Dutchess County and USGS maintain gauging programs. There's a new gauge now in Fishkill being put in by Dutchess County because the USGS doesn't have a complete network of their gauges. So those are some comments.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Russell. Now we're going to touch on a topic that Alyssa actually already raised, which is source water protection plans. Alyssa, can you let us know, help us understand what a source water protection plan is and who is responsible for preparing it, and why is it important? How does it help us?
So right now, there's no standard template for what a source water protection plan is. There was, in the early 2000s, an effort by New York State Department of Health statewide where public water systems were assessed. Some of you guys may have heard it as the SWAP, the Source Water Assessment Program. That consists of a map of the drainage area, so the watershed for reservoirs or the recharge areas for wells, plus a report. And the three goals of the SWAP program, or the SWAPs, were, one was to map the drainage areas for surface and ground drinking water sources. The second was to inventory the land uses within that area. And the third was to assign a probability or susceptibility rating as to contamination probability to that drinking water. So those were done in the early 2000s. They exist for every public water system, and you can request that information from your local water operator, your local water department, and they should have it. If they don't, which be prepared, they may not be aware of this because they have kind of sat on the shelf a lot. They've been forgotten. And in that case, your local water department can request it from either County Health or New York State Department of Health. As a caveat, there are known errors within these reports. There are about 9,000 public water systems statewide and about 14,000 source waters. So these were done in a very short period of time for a lot of sources, and there are known errors, one of which, as Peter pointed out, which is the most glaring one that I've seen. I haven't looked at all the SWAPs, but I've looked at a fair number where, as Peter mentioned, there is a whole, I would say about a third of the watershed, a source watershed for Newburgh's drinking water sources is missing from the map. My suspicion is that the complicated artificial diversion of the water, where the water comes from and where it drains to, depending on a certain diversion gate being open or not and where the water's discharging to, the consultants who put together that report probably missed that piece, but that is something that internally DEC and DOH is aware of. So in terms of permits and things like that, that's taken into account. But just so you all, if you do get your hands on a SWAP and you're looking at it, be aware that there may be some errors in there. However, it's the only statewide source water information that's available right now, and it is a starting point. You'll see you'll see, as I said, there's a map of the drainage area, which would be good to get field verified by, if you're on groundwater, by an expert such as Russell. They do engineering studies like that, and they can help you map out a more accurate drainage area. You'll see a list of potential contaminants linked to land uses. So if there is, gas stations or chemical bulk storage, those would be indicated on there. Again, good to verify because land use has changed. In Newburgh, I would say probably over the past 10 years, it's vastly different. It used to be mostly farmland, so verify those. And then the next step after the assessment information would be the protection plan. And as I said, there's no template set for that. However, there are a few elements that make sense to have in there. And the estuary program, I assist communities in working through that. So if there is interest in somebody who wants to do a protection plan, please do come talk to me or reach out to me, and I can tell you all about it. And we do have a template that we have started using. I think that's
That
it.
sounds great. Thank you, Alyssa. I would like to let people know that if you could, Hudson Highlands Land Trust staff are going to walk around and collect your questions right now, which we'll be asking at the end of this our question period. And then the other thing, which is very interesting, the Hudson Valley Regional Council recently did a survey of all of the municipalities in the Mid-Hudson region to find out whether they had actually developed source water protection plans, and most actually had not. A majority of them had actually, of course, were aware of the source water assessment program and participated in that, but many have not gone to developing plans yet, even though they have a tremendous amount of interest in doing so, which is great to hear. Yes?
May I follow up briefly on Alicia?
Sure.
You know, this issue that's been brought up, do you understand how much pollution is going into your watershed, is really the core question for us all, because what communities do is they make the information more accurate by participating in the process by which we determine how safe our water sources are. I actually prefer to say water source than source water because it sounds a little less jargony. And so I'd like to say something that Riverkeeper has done over the last 2 years to foster a better understanding of the pollutants that go into the system and then foster efforts to reduce those pollutants. And so if you want to take one thing away from my remarks today, it's score your drinking water safety levels. Riverkeeper, working with the Center for Watershed Protection, created a scorecard that has been used in 7 upriver municipalities, the ones that take their drinking water supply from the Hudson, because north of Newburgh, as earlier alluded to, the drinking water there's less salt from the open water in the ocean, and you can drink the water as long as it's not polluted with other contaminants. So we created this scorecard, and the scorecard is designed to assess how good a municipality is at reducing pollution. Are the planning laws good in protecting areas that recharge aquifers? Are the planning laws good on buffers around wetlands? It also looks at whether the local municipalities are actively examining the places that have permits to discharge pollution to make sure those permits are being honored and enforced. Also make sure that you understand where hazardous waste sites might be. So do you understand, you have your arms around your landscape? Because once you have your arms around your landscape, you can take measures to reduce the contaminants, as Alyssa just said a moment ago. You can enforce your laws better. You can create new land use regulations. You can make sure your permitting is done in a way that reduces contaminants consistent with best practices. And you can also invest some of the $110 million that's available under that $2.5 billion act that Sandy Galiff referred to earlier in land conservation, because for the first time now, Riverkeeper worked with the governor's office and the legislature to put some of that money aside for land acquisition specifically to protect drinking water sources. I had the great pleasure of working in the land trust community for 10 years and also working for the Department of Environmental Conservation for 10 years. When I worked for the Department of Conservation in the 90s, they had 4,200 staff members. Today, I think it's fewer than 2,800. So if we're not all doing our jobs to support the DEC and support the municipalities, we're just not going to get our arms around our drinking water safety, and we're going to regret it.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to move on to the portion of the panel where we have your questions. We're going to be asking your questions. So the first question is bottled water better than tap water? And I love that question because I'm so happy that we're here and we don't have bottled water. Excellent. So I think that I would love to throw this to either Paul or Alyssa, but anyone's welcome to answer that.
I just spoke, so
This is when I wish I had one of my colleagues from Department of Health here. So here's what I know. Bottled water is not regulated under the EPA and the Department of Health standards for finished drinking water that I talked about earlier. It's administered under FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, which to my understanding is a less stringent standard to meet. However, in New York State, Department of Health does test bottled water as well. So I know that from speaking with my colleagues at Department of Health. It's not true for all states. Some states have bottled water purely regulated under whatever FDA says. But in New York, I would say you can be assured that the bottled water you're drinking is at least as good as the tap water. I'm going to caveat this majorly because this is not my expertise, but this is what I understand so far.
Thank you. The next question is, how do you propose to stop salt trucks on our roads from polluting our well water? So the over-application of salt to our roads from polluting our well water. Let's see, Russell, might you want to answer that?
One of the things that has plagued municipal budgets, but is in fact protecting groundwater quality, is that the price of salt has been going up. And so you see many communities moving to brine, which at the end of the day administers a lot less salt because it's targeted and you don't have a residue that lingers into the summer. So that's a good outcome. There is a pretty simple set of tests that one can run if you have water in your well and you think it's from road salt. The usual bright line question is, could it be water softener salt? And there's just some easy ways to distinguish that, which we could talk about. The stormwater guidance or the rules for the state of New York do discourage infiltrating road runoff into infiltrating galleries, which is smart. There are still some towns that put infiltrators along the road, which has always struck me as not a good idea. The places where you're most likely to have a road salt in your well might be if you're near the bottom of a steep hill where a lot of salt is applied to make the road passable. So there's some coincidence sometimes between where you have salt and where you don't. The best way for salt to not get in the well is if the road drainage is effective in delivering it to the stream. And I don't want to insult the stream here. I don't want you to think that I'm harsh on streams. But in fact, in the spring or in the winter, when we do have melt periods and snow laced with salt is leaving the road margins, those are usually the times when the stream flow is up. So that's, in fact, the best time of year for the stream to be able to handle a dose of salt, much better than in the middle of summer when the flow is very low. So if we need a time when the de-icing chemical should leave the landscape, the best time to do it is when the stream flows are high. And so if the roadside drainage is working correctly and there aren't infiltrators, those are your best chances to keep it off. And then economics is leading us towards less de-icing chemical application. To some degree, we, the public, do still like to have a very clear road. And until that sort of cultural expectation is changed, we're going to be using salt.
And I would just chime in here that in addition to as part of the $2.5 billion Water Act from last year, there's money for land acquisition, as was mentioned earlier, but there is also money available for salt shed or salt storage relocation away from drinking water sources. So if that is an issue in your town, there's funding from the state available to help with the cost of moving it to a more drinking water protection-friendly spot. So again, that's the Water Quality Improvement Program or the WQIP program, and you can find information on there. the other last thing I'll say quickly is in conversations with DOT and the Thruway Authority as well, because in certain areas in the Hudson Valley that have a lot of road surface area, like in Newburgh, you have the Thruway and you have 84 and you have many other roads crisscrossing through the watershed. Road salt is an issue. I know in Westchester as well, talking with the water operators, some of the water operators here, road salt is a big concern as well. They're noticing more and more higher occurrences of salt in the drinking water that they then have to treat for. And if the salt levels are above a certain number, the water plant is obligated to send out a public notice letting the customers know that the sodium level is above a certain threshold for those residents who might have heart issues or are more sensitive to sodium for health reasons. So they're issuing kind of more of those notices. CARI, Institute for Environmental Studies, CARI IES, they recently did a forum on road salt where there was a lot of information from experts around the country actually who came, and I believe that information is all posted on their website. So if you Google CARI Institute, you will find a lot of information on road salt there.
Thank you, Alyssa. The next question that we have, I'd like to combine a little bit with a prior question, and this would go to Peter. So in Newburgh, are you discussing the development of a source water protection plan to help address your source water? And then also, as an extension, why are, and this might go to Alyssa, I'm not sure, why are SWAP reports, the source water assessment program reports mentioned by Alyssa, so difficult to obtain? And I have to acknowledge that, yes, they are difficult to find, trying to find some myself. And why not make them available? And is that going to be part of this new programming that's going to be available? But should we start with Peter?
All right, let me start the answer. Alyssa is working on a very accurate and actually quite brilliant source water assessment plan for the city of Newburgh's watershed, which includes forward-looking practices that would protect the watershed from vulnerabilities along Route 300, along Route 17K, where there's so much development and where, if something happens on any of those roads, the chemicals or whatever might occur from that accident would wind up directly in the river. My concern is, and this is not easy to say, Elisa, you referred to, the really crummy source water assessment plans of years past. They were inaccurate. They were hard to get. They barely existed. And there seems to be an absence of an ability to dovetail the plans with any kind of implementation or enforcement of best practices within the watershed. And at some point, I hope today, we'll be able to talk about home rule, because that is the monster in the room. But, to reduce this, if there's no ability to implement a source water assessment plan in a reasonable way for a municipal water system, is there really a difference between a great plan like yours and a piece of crap? And if none of them can come into play, what's the story? So, this is the thing that makes my hair fall out. You may have noticed.
Yeah, so I think one of the downfalls with the SWAP, the assessment, the DOH SWAP that was done earlier, was that it was kind of a top-down process from my understanding, where EPA nationwide said, all states, you shall assess your source waters. And so they gave a bunch of money to New York. It came to DOH. Okay.
When you're done,
okay.
I'll speak to that. Great.
And so my sense is that, clearly there was no implementation done after these assessments were done, right? They kind of sat on the shelf. And my suspicion, and maybe Russell can enlighten you guys as well on this, is that it was a top-down process where the water operators locally got this report I don't know how involved they were, but they were just kind of given this assessment and they said, well, okay, what do you want me to do with this? And at the time, unless there is some sort of emergency contamination event that's going to prod some reaction, if everything seemed okay, then people just went along as they did. So which is why I think when it comes to source water protection, hopefully this time around, I think the local role is so important that the communities truly understand where their source waters are and what the drainage areas are and get involved that way. And in terms of the home rule issue, before Russell, I turn it over to you, I'll just say I think that's where the implementation falls apart frequently as well, is because especially when you're talking about surface water, so when you have a reservoir, the drainage area for that reservoir usually spans more than one municipality, and it may be entirely located outside of the municipality that uses it as drinking water. And it may be viewed by the host municipality not as drinking water, so they don't value it the same way. And what is source protection all about? It comes down to land use and zoning decisions and intelligently figuring out what should go on the land and what shouldn't, because that's all going to end up in the water. This is where the home rule piece comes in. New York is a home rule state. Those land decisions are by default within the jurisdiction of the municipality, which makes a lot of sense, but when it comes to watersheds and drainage areas, can really set things up to be at odds with each other.
Well, those are the issues of health and safety.
And that's what gets in the way of implementation a lot of times, is that the municipality where that reservoir is located in may decide it wants to develop it out, so that brings in some local dollars. It will degrade the water quality to that reservoir, but you know what? They don't use it as drinking water, so they're doing kind of what's in their best interest. But then what's the end result you get? You get bad water quality there. So I'll turn it over to Russell about this.
Have Paul follow up with that, then Russell, please.
So, I've worked in 3 nonprofits and for 2 government agencies, and all the processes I saw work best were collaborative. And we all know that. It's almost a cliche. But Riverkeeper, when it did this scorecard project with these 7 municipalities, city and town of Poughkeepsie, village and town of Rhinebeck, Esopus, Hyde Park, and one other that I'm just sorry to say I'm not remembering off the top of my head, they agreed to create an intermunicipal council that was designed to protect their water supply. When I worked for the DEC, we had a collaborative process to determine how strict the New York City drinking water, a wastewater treatment system permit should be. When I was at Westchester Land Trust, we had something we called the Westchester Open Space Alliance, where municipalities as far-flung as North Salem at one corner and New Rochelle at another corner of the county would collaborate. Because if you collaborate like this and you learn one another's challenges, you don't necessarily skip down the hill holding hands, smiling, but it's harder to disregard the reasonable concerns of your neighbor if you're in a council and you know that you can count on them at another time and that you have to be responsive to somebody that you have a regular interaction with. So we are dedicated at Riverkeeper to fostering as many of these intermunicipal councils as we can, so that municipalities become a little bit more sensitive to one another's needs. And we try it in the nonprofit community too. Michelle and her colleagues at Hudson Highlands Land Trust, and Ned Sullivan and his colleagues at Scenic Hudson, Riverkeeper, Clearwater, Hudson River Watershed Alliance. We all try to be collaborative because better decisions and more efficient decisions get made as a consequence. So it may sound like cliche, but it's exactly the opposite. It can get very granular and very constructive, and it can take a home rule state and make it a little bit more efficient in how it operates.
Russell, would you like to follow up? Or?
A couple comments that I wanted to throw in is that, I am a consultant, and I remember looking at the RFP, which came out seeking consultants to write those swap reports. And at the end of the day, Part of the reason that they are what they are is because the winning team bid a couple $100 per study. It was, they were done with remote sensing, they were done with GIS-based maps, and that was the budget that was available. That wasn't the consultant's fault for bidding it at that level. That was the RFP, that was the expectation, and that's what you got. So, and I remember being just appalled because I have done detailed municipal aquifer studies for a half dozen municipalities up until the crash, right? I mean, basically all these kind of studies stopped in 2007 and 8. But prior to that, Pleasant Valley or the Harlem Valley or Gardner or Phillipstown were funding with appropriate dollars, careful studies to identify where their recharge areas were, where their source waters were, what the groundwater flow were, and that would all feed into a functional and productive groundwater protection plan for those municipalities. This pushed it down to a level that was, in my opinion, idiotic. So that's why the swaps are what they are. Properly funded source water studies can't be done at that kind of a budget level, which I think is being recognized now, and some municipalities are creeping back in with their own money as they understand, and they're starting to experiencing development pressure again. Others are leaning on grants, but that's the way it needs to go. I will say that the home rule problem has been one that I've been party to discussions on for my entire career, and there is much truth to it. But there is a silver lining in something I said earlier today, is that if you understand that every well in a municipality is that person's aquifer, there is a selfish interest in every municipality for their own residents to pass an aquifer protection ordinance, as Phillipstown did, as many towns have done, and as that model ordinance that I referenced earlier is available to do. That model ordinance is designed to try to maintain the quality of groundwater within the footprint of that town for the residents of the town. But guess what? Every element of it is useful for the downstream town as well. And so if, instead of saying, hey, we need to protect an ordinance because of the folks downhill, I mean, I understand that that's a weaker argument, but I think that the right argument, and a very valid one, is to say every municipality, in fact, should be thinking about a local groundwater aquifer protection program, which, if you don't mess up the aquifer, suddenly the stream flows a little better too, and then the downstream party benefits. So I would take this the other direction and stop weeping and wailing about home rule and start looking at local groundwater protection programs, because everybody downstream also benefits, and I think that's the leverage, and I think it's the way to go.
Thank you. And I certainly appreciate the mention of, you're mentioning culture, Russell, because culture is extremely important to making forward movement in any area that needs forward movement. So understanding your culture and how to work with your municipality's culture to implement these types of new programmings is really important. This next question is actually a question that can be applicable to all of the panelists in different ways. A recent testing program allowed Putnam, Westchester residents to collect tap water samples and have them tested for lead content. Will this program be expanded to allow testing for other contaminants? And more specifically, has Riverkeeper done any kind of advocacy work around that? How would the residents of Newburgh feel? Would that make them have greater trust in their municipal water? And then any other background information that Russell and Alyssa could provide.
Well, I heard Riverkeeper mentioned in the question, Carla, so I'll say that Riverkeeper works with 15 different universities and 200 different volunteer citizen scientists to do water quality testing. Principally, we test for bacteria, which none of us wants to have in our drinking water, and dissolved oxygen, which is something fish need to have before they can actually use the rivers and streams as habitat. We also have been involved in some of these studies with other universities on pharmaceutical disposal practices and how they've led to residues of pharmaceuticals getting into our river. And I'll never forget the name of the editorial after the study was released in the Albany Times-Union. It was called, "This is Your River on Drugs." Great title. Also plastics, a comment earlier on plastic bottled water. You have plastic residue in the water, in the bottled water. It's been established. The water quality is not properly regulated. I'm sure it's safe enough, but it's not as good as our drinking water because we have some of the best drinking water in the world here. And if you are home and drinking bottled water and there's not something actually wrong with your well, put some of that money into Hudson Highlands Land Trust, please. And so what I would say is that if we don't continue to test more aggressively, we're not going to find these emerging contaminants of concern. The Safe Drinking Water Act requires testing of about 90 contaminants, yet there are thousands of other contaminants that we know are emerging and of concern. So testing's got to increase.
Go ahead.
Okay. So,
That's why I stopped talking.
all right, great.
Oh, I'm sorry. The quick comment on lead is that, there was a concern that lead was coming to people through fixtures, and so the funding was for schools to test all their taps. And the result was that largely, if you look at the data, it was the older drinking fountains that didn't have the newer plumbing fixtures in it that were releasing some lead as water was going through them. So public water systems, we haven't sort of parsed this vocabulary today. Community water systems, which are the systems that provide water to homes. Community water systems are supposed to regulate the corrosivity of the water. And corrosivity of the water defines the characteristic of water to leach lead out of pipes. And so a community water system is not supposed to be delivering water to you that has the propensity to do that. So even if you have older fixtures in your house, the lead is supposed to stay in the pipe because non-corrosive water is what you're getting. Not all the schools had necessarily tested for corrosivity, and certainly most of us on wells, and I include myself, have no idea whether our well water is corrosive because it's another set of tests, so the new building code requires that your plumbing fixtures don't have lead in them, and that's the other way of getting at making sure that you don't have lead. So I don't know whether there's a need for additional lead testing, but that's some comment on that. I would tell you that many samples fail for lead because there's turbidity in the water. And if you have a turbid-free water, often there is no lead in the water itself. The lab analytical process draws lead out of the little bits of turbidity, and you can get false positives that have nothing to do with the quality of water.
Thank you, Alyssa.
On the issue of emerging contaminants,
That's a good one.
there is a Drinking Water Quality Council that DEC, DOH are on, as well as academia and water operators. They are tasked with coming up with MCLs, or maximum contaminant limits. So these are enforceable numerical limits for 3 CECs, or emerging contaminants, which are PFOA, PFOS, and 1,4-dioxane. So they are supposed to have these recommended MCLs for DOH by the end of this year, I believe. So this is an example of the state not waiting for EPA to come up with MCLs for those contaminants, and the state is setting its own. So those should be out by the end of this year.
Thank you. This next question, and I would like to say we're down to our last 2 questions, even though there is a table full of questions. There are many questions that unfortunately we will not be able to get to, but our panel, we'll get to them right now. We'll get to them during the breakout, and then our panelists are also going to be here today, so that I think they should be prepared for many questions from our people here today. How, and I'd like to start this question off with Peter. How would you like information like this to be gotten out to the layperson? And, to the average everyday person, what is the best way that they can be informed about these issues and know what kind of action they can take? In your experience with Newburgh, what would have been ideal? And then I would love for anybody else to chime in on that. Thank you.
Well, participation is critical, and I think people need to understand that by participating either on planning boards or conservation councils, or zoning boards, attending governmental meetings, that has meaning. And you can't just blow it off and say, well, it doesn't matter, or everything will work out well in the end. And maybe this is a leap, but I think it's very important in view of the conversation we've sort of danced around with home rule, and what a number of you have said at the outset, is that the closer you get to your own plans and the authority you have to control your watersheds and your catchment areas, you can actually protect your water. I think to expect that it's going to happen, at the top of the food chain is really not a very useful way of thinking. I mean, looking at, going back those 9 years and discovering all of the mistakes, a lot of what the EPA's rules and regulations are, I think a lot of the Clean Water Act and a lot of the Clean Drinking Water Act is largely aspirational. And to make it useful to us, to we the people who actually drink the water and rely on it, requires work happening as close to the local as you can get it. And if people can be made to understand that they matter, you can make it happen.
Following up on this question of how to share information, we have this report that we did with the Center for Watershed Protection on the results of the scorecard process in the 7 municipalities. That's available at our website. Michelle, I'd be happy to provide it so you could make it available on your website. And it has all the questions, and the questions are things that if you become familiar with, you say, well, that shouldn't be that hard. I want to say that to echo Peter's point about what happens when you get involved. Most of you were at least involved a little on this question of whether there would be new crude oil storage, barge, and tanker anchorages on the Hudson, and you're probably aware that instead of those anchorages, what we got was something that is called a Ports and Waterways Safety Assessment. You may have heard the acronym PAWSA, but like I said, I hate acronyms and I hate jargon, and I think they distance you from what's really important. And that safety assessment is what was used to say, we don't need these anchorages, but instead, why don't we have a collaboration between the maritime industry, the municipalities, the environmental groups, on improving safety on the Hudson? And so what we have is John Lipscomb, our boat captain at Riverkeeper, and the head of the Pilots Association are now co-leading a Hudson River Safety Committee, which is designed to make sure that we won't ever need these anchorages. So, you have a huge potential for success, and I'm sorry to say it, I can't stay after the panel is done because I have to write remarks for something that is absolutely unique in my experience. I was asked to go to China on Thursday and help the Chinese understand how citizens in the U.S. affect environmental policy because they want to do more of it, and Lord knows they need to. So you guys are the epicenter of change. Don't stop doing it.
Alyssa?
I'll say quickly, if you're interested in keeping up to date on source water information, come see me. I will add your email or contact info to my list. And I've been thinking about maybe doing an event regionally around the Hudson area where maybe once a year, twice a year, we can kind of get together and I can hear and learn about local concerns and share what information I know. So in terms of the estuary program, we are definitely all about empowering communities to get involved in the process, because it's you guys who know what's best and know your area the best. So we provide technical assistance to help you guys do that. I think in the end of the day, when it comes to implementation too, source water protection is going to happen at the local level, and it's going to need input from you guys in order to be successful. So our role is to help that happen. So if you are interested, I definitely encourage you to please reach out to me, or Michelle has my contact info as well. So yeah, and I welcome that.
And look at Phillipstown's aquifer protection ordinance. I mean, this town here has done a good job, and that's available to any municipality to adopt.
So the last question. Panelists have focused on source water in reservoirs, but many of the residents here rely on private wells for their water. Is the quality and health of the aquifers monitored? By whom, and where is the data available?
The regional health of aquifers is not monitored on a regular basis. The regional status of aquifers, in other words, what are the water levels in the aquifers, are monitored to varying degrees of precision. And I can tell you on those data are encouraging. You know, aquifers are not being depleted. Every winter they fill up again as we get into our autumn rains and as the trees stop sucking up 20% of the 50% of the precipitation. You know, we would have fuller aquifers if we cut all the trees, but I never get far with that I never get far with that argument. But you know, as the trees stop sucking, you know, taking their moisture, and the autumn rains come and the winter snow melts, the aquifers are always full. Dutchess County did a statistical distribution of groundwater sampling in rural areas a couple years ago, and basically came back with a finding that groundwater quality was pretty good in all the rural areas. We had to sample only for a limited number of things. It was a budgeted project, but that was encouraging. There is a line of thinking that says if you have a domestic well, you might be well suited to go to your local lab and maybe every 3 or 4 years pull a couple $100 worth of analytes. You might be able to catch, you know, did we pick up some salt, or, you know, did my lawn mowing or my neighbor's lawn mowing drop some gas in the ground? You know, whatever. It doesn't cost a lot to run a simple scan, and that might be well afforded to do that. No one else is going to do it for you.
All right. Well, I think that we are now perfectly primed for lunch. I hope that all of our panelists have given you much food for thought. And again, you will be able to have other opportunities to ask your questions and learn more during the other parts of today's event. And I would like to thank our panelists for being here today and sharing their expertise, and to all of you for sharing your questions.